here today to discuss solar noise rulemaking on behalf of DEQ. This is a pretty unusual situation. I'm a relatively new rulemaking coordinator. I am a rulemaking coordinator for the siting division at the Oregon Department of Energy. But through a sort of weird happenstance of just how things have evolved, there's a situation where DEQ has rules that apply to energy projects that are built in the state of Oregon that they don't really apply outside of, well, they don't really apply to them at all. We apply them, but they are DEQ rules. So we made the decision that we, wanted to update these rules to reflect sort of recent trends, and we reached out to DEQ, and so they said, yeah, we'll be happy to help you with that. But this is a sort of a strange situation where ODO is kind of driving the desire to change the substance of the rules, but this is still being done via the DEQ rulemaking process. And they sort of have different ways of doing things. And so I've been sort of learning that and navigating that. But Rachel is my DEQ liaison, and she is here to help, and she has been great and working with me to kind of get this rulemaking up and running. Let's go ahead and dive right into it, unless anybody has any sort of preliminary questions. So we have the agenda here. It's currently set for 2 hours, but I do not anticipate it taking that long, but I've been surprised before. Sometimes things go faster and sometimes things go slower. I tend to talk kind of fast. So if I'm going too quickly for you, or, you have some tips for me to help you understand things better, you want me to slow down, please let me know, and then I will try to remember and do the best that I can for you. So why don't we go ahead and move to introductions here. Again, I'm Tom Jackman, and I am the rules coordinator for the Oregon Department of Energy for the Energy Facility Siting Team. My boss is Todd Cornett, who is the Assistant Director for Siting, but he is not here today, I don't think. And then go ahead, Rachel. So let's quickly do a little round. So I meant go ahead and introduce yourself.
Did someone from the RAC want to come off mute first and introduce themselves? We can popcorn around.
I'll just call out. So Yvonne, why don't you start, and I'll go left to right on my screen here.
Yes, I'm Yvonne Scott, and I'm representing the area and the public, and we'll see where this goes.
Great. Brandon?
Good afternoon, everyone. Brandon Persinger with the Association of Oregon Counties. I do land use and natural resources on behalf of Oregon's counties. Thanks for having me.
Troy?
Yeah, hi, I'm Troy Jones. I live in the Harrisburg, Oregon area, and I'm the first timer to a Rules Advisory Committee, but interested to see how this all goes.
All right. David?
Hi, everyone. David Lawler. I'm the Executive Director of NextEra Energy, which is a developer that develops renewable energy in the Oregon area. My territory is all things northwest.
Let's see. Max, you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. Hi, everybody. My name is Max Green. I'm the Deputy Director of an organization called Renewable Northwest. We're a 501c3 with both renewable energy developer and environmental NGO members that has a mission to achieve decarbonization of the region we work in, which is Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. I am coming to you from my home in Tigard.
All right. Jack?
Thanks, Tom. My name is Jack Watson. I'm the policy director for the Oregon Solar and Storage Industries Association, which is a trade association that represents the solar industry all the way from rooftop to utility scale development.
Okay, and then Emily?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, I'm Emily Griffith. I'm the Oregon Policy Manager for Renewable Northwest, and Max already described Renewable Northwest, so I'll just say I'm calling in from Manlius, Oregon. Thanks.
Okay, great. So as you can see here, we sort of tried to get people from across the spectrum here of potential interests, and I think we, were successful here. So it's a pretty small RAC, but I think this is, as you'll see, it's a sort of laser focused rulemaking. Some rulemakings, I'm involved in some other ones that are, that are proposing dozens of changes and rule deletions and rule additions and all this crazy stuff and has huge impacts. This is a much narrower, more focused rulemaking effort that's really sort of much more modest in scope, but at the same time, we do have rulemakings that are so small and simple that we just don't even bother with the Rules Advisory Committee. This is an optional kind of function of rulemaking. It's not required by the rules, but we felt like this was impactful enough that it was important to get the sort of advice from a Rules Advisory Committee that represented the constituent interests that are impacted by this rule change. So go ahead and go next slide, Rachel. So just as a reminder, pretty basic stuff, but I'm going to strive to keep the agenda and topic going. So if you could do the same, if there's some stuff that is sort of tangentially related, but that you want to bring to me, or that could be maybe outside the scope of this rulemaking, but you feel like is relevant, I'm certainly open to kind of reaching out to you outside of this RAC. So just important to keep an open mind and understand kind of where everybody's coming from. I think we all have our best interests at heart, and we're all here in sort of a good faith effort to make the rules better. But that may mean, as we're not all going to agree on the best course. So it's just important to remember that. So go ahead and go next slide. Just so you know, some of you I know are much more familiar with this process, and I know several of you, this is your first rulemaking advisory committee effort. So basically, the way this works for DEQ, and also for most rulemaking that's done in the state of Oregon, is it starts with sort of developing a draft set of rules, and that can, or in this case, will involve the rulemaking advisory committee. And in some cases, there might be 2 years of RAC meetings. You might meet, 12 times. We had scheduled one RAC meeting because we sort of already kind of know what we were hoping to do, and we're sort of using the RAC here as a sort of sounding board to make sure we're not missing something. So this sort of portion of this rulemaking process is going to be much more narrow and focused than if you were to sign up for another rulemaking advisory committee. It might be a lot different than this. This first box might take a really long time. So that's probably not going to be the case here. Once we are sort of come to, I don't want to say happy because some of you may not be happy, but once we sort of get to what DEQ and ODO feel is optimal kind of draft language, then we would then issue what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking, which is a sort of a formal filing with the Secretary of State. We have to send off communications to the legislators that are potentially involved in this, and then that begins the formal rulemaking process of opening it up to the public comment. You're welcome, to if you feel like maybe things you said during the RAC weren't heard or understood, you can then participate again, sort of just as a member of the public during the sort of notice of proposed rulemaking phase of this process. And there'll be a certain, I think, I can't remember exactly how many days we have scheduled, but I think it's on the next slide for that. But plenty of opportunity. As you can see there, the public comment period is that third box there. And then once that period ends, we sort of take all the feedback and then, make any changes. If anybody came up with some amazing ideas, we're like, oh, didn't think of that, let's put that in there. Or this is outside the scope or whatever. We then would recommend that to the EQC, which is a board that basically makes the decisions. So I think in this particular rulemaking, is the director of DEQ is going to be doing the final approval for this rulemaking. Yvonne, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering where in that would a contested case be?
Yes. So, well, I guess for me, contested case relates to this. You mean you're talking about for the siting of energy projects?
Yes, let's just say the DEQ rulemaking process becomes at a point where it's fractured and there's a contested case. So I'm looking at this screen in front of me. I'm just wondering where that lies at the end
So
of it.
there is no for rulemaking. There is no contested case. So that's contested case is the result of sort of citing decisions that are done by councils in approving projects, and people feel like the projects were improperly approved. Then you would take that to a contested case. For rulemaking, it's just sort of, I mean, it's like, when the legislators pass a law you don't like, there's really no recourse. So you're participating in the process, you're making your voice heard, but ultimately, once the director DEQ approves it, and assuming it's, I guess, so you can challenge rules, but basically the only reason you would challenge a rule is if you felt like it the rules were not followed. So there are rules for creating new rules and for modifying the rules, and they relate to things like notice, or maybe there's specific, like the very specific rules we're changing. This has happened recently. There might be rules about things you need to do as part of changing that particular rule, and if you're like, well, you didn't follow those rules, people do file lawsuits, and they do. That's the contested case. Is it's just a lawsuit that gets filed. It's not a extrajudicial thing like the contested case. It's just a formal lawsuit where you sue the state and you say you did it wrong, or you don't have the authority to make these rules. We can only make rules that we have the authority that are given to us by the legislature. They create programs. They created ODO. They created DQ, and they said you need to create rules to implement the programs that we want you to, and you have this authority. So if we make a rule that's outside of that authority, then it should be challenged and it should be overturned. But if the rule is within the authority of the agency, and it was done in a way that follows the guidelines of providing notice, providing a comment period, doing all of the crossing the T's and dotting the I's, that's it. That's the new rule. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, so it would actually be at the end of the so
yeah, once everything's all said and done, yeah, if you have some issues, it wouldn't be a contested case. It would you just go straight to filing a lawsuit.
Right, it'd be a contested case that you would go towards the state. That's what I'm just trying to understand. Okay.
Yeah, I guess it's just more like terminology. For me, a contested case is sort of like a hearing. It's almost like an arbitration, where you have a hearing officer sort of hash out that everything was done properly, which could then go to court. But we don't have that process. It would just go straight to court for rulemaking.
Thank you.
All right. Next slide. So here's the sort of timeline here. We have this meeting today, and then we're going to have if we don't have any additional meetings, and I don't think it's certainly not the plan right now, then we would publish our proposed rulemaking at the end of the month. There would be a 21-day public comment period. We'd have a public hearing as well. So you could submit written comments, or you can attend the actual public hearing and make your voice heard there. We would then take that feedback, polish the draft rules some more potentially, and then we would then present our recommendations of that rule language to the DEQ decision makers, as it were, in this case, the director. And then, assuming the director doesn't have any issues with what we present and agrees with the proposal, they just sign off it, and that's the new rule. All right, go ahead. Next slide. So, just to give you guys some background, this is sort of sort of an echo of what was done 20 years ago. I mean, literally 20 years ago in 2004, DEQ amended their rules relating to sound and noise for the siting of wind electrical generation facilities. Now, those rules have been in place for 20 years now. But to this day, and we'll get to that in, I think, the next slide, it only applies to wind. And that really hasn't been an issue because in the early 2000s, almost all the new energy projects that were being proposed were wind based. But that's, if you've been paying attention, that's dramatically changed. And now the energy pipeline is almost entirely solar. So now we find ourselves in 2024 taking a look at those changes that were made for the wind rules. And, you know, some questions were asked, why is this just wind? Why isn't this also solar? So that's what we're looking at today. Go ahead and go next slide. So yeah, pretty much just did that. But the wind rules have been in place for 20 years, and we haven't really had any issues with those. So we're now just kind of seeking to expand that. All right, go ahead. So just to give you an idea, the data I had was through January 2023. We had 8 solar-specific applications that had, you know, they have what are called noise-sensitive receptors that they have to place in various places to do their noise analysis for each project. And so those 8 projects produced had 81 modeled locations. 17 of those modeled locations exceeded what we call the ambient noise degradation standard. So for those who think, oh, well, solar panels, you just sit there. I mean, I have them on my roof right now. I can't hear anything. There's no sound. Well, maybe a couple of panels on your roof, but when any energy installation is going to have sort of electrical equipment that can produce sound, whether that's the transformers or the, you know, sort of the transmission lines. You know, these things, I actually thought about putting an audio clip in here, but we've all heard, you know, sort of electrical stuff make sound. And these projects have and do make sound, and in some cases have modeled outside of our acceptable standard. For those 17 modeled locations, there was nothing they could do outside of mitigation. I mean, that's it. So let's kind of go to the next slide, and I'll kind of talk a little bit about what that noise degradation standard is. In a second. So the purpose of this rulemaking is to increase the efficiency of the siting process while still protecting the health and safety of Oregonians and safeguarding their state resources. And one of those resources is the ability to enjoy, you know, living and experiencing recreational areas or living in your own home in a manner that is not, you know, impacted by, you know, projects outside of the acceptable limits that are set by the state. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So we kind of talked about this, but the purpose of this is to change the rules in Division 35, which are DEQ rules, to allow solar energy generation facilities to demonstrate compliance with the noise regulations in the same manner as allowed for wind electrical generation facilities. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So yeah, this is the thing I was alluding to before. So understanding kind of the key part here is you have sort of 2 main noise things, and they produce sort of just a simple formula where you have the ambient noise level, you know, just the sound of before a project is built, just how loud is that particular site. That's called the ambient noise level. And then you have the generated facility noise, which is the sound that the installation is expected to produce. And it's usually not just one pinpoint. You know, if it's 200 acres of solar panels and electrical equipment and stuff, they might, you know, have to do, you know, 15 different locations to do a sort of a noise test at that area. So you would check the ambient noise level at that area, and you would check the modeled generated facility noise. And you know, as you might imagine, if you build a facility right next to the freeway, it's going to have a different ambient noise level than if you build it, you know, in the middle of a tranquil, you know, meadow. That's going to be 2 different ambient noise levels. So, but the end result is that if you take the generated noise facility and you subtract the ambient noise level, you cannot increase the ambient noise level by more than 10 decibels. Those are the current rules as they are currently applied for solar facilities. Any questions about that particular? This is sort of the heart of what we're going to be talking about, this slide here. So it's pretty straightforward, but at the same time, I've been looking at these for months, so it took me a little while to get my head around this. But yeah, I see a couple of hands. Yvonne, why don't you go first?
So I'm looking at this and I've read a lot of the Oregon rules and changing over. And you're looking at an area that's, as we know, high value farmland and rural. And there's no real precedence for actually coming in and putting commercial and industrial sound in an area like that, and disturbing the natural area and rural residents. Do we have any other areas that they've done that?
So we have, first of all, there are several solar facilities that have been built in the state, but we also have numerous wind facilities that were built in areas of they have various impacts, whether that's to sort of the view or they produce sound as well. But yes, so we do have precedent for building this stuff, but just to be clear that what we're doing here today, the only thing we're evaluating is how these particular sound rules are applied to proposed solar projects. So there are sort of statewide goals, and there are with how we preserve land and how we protect the state's resources. And to build a facility in a certain area, you have to meet what are called goal exceptions. So in other words, there is a pathway. So this is high value farmland. In order to build a solar facility here, you have to prove A, B, and C. If it's not high value farmland, then you only have to prove maybe B and C, for example. So there is a sort of legal pathway for building these. But part of that pathway is you can't exceed 10 dBA of an increase over the ambient noise level. So this is the one specific rule we're looking at today. Troy, did you have a question too? You put your hand down, but you're muted. Don't worry, I do that all the time.
Not accustomed to unmuting.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's okay.
I think I answered my question, Tom, but the ambient noise level, for using your example, if it was by a freeway, whatever that noise level is, you couldn't say it was 20 dBA. You couldn't then exceed 30 dBA at that location. Did I understand you correctly?
Yes, and this was super duper confusing for me because, but I finally started, and honestly, it took me a lot of sort of analysis before to thinking about it. But you have to realize that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how noisy it is. Think about it this way: if there's one person singing, and then you add another person singing, it's now louder, right? But if you have 10 person singing it's still louder. It is definitely going to be louder, but it's still sort of like it's relatively, not as much. So the way sound sort of logarithmically increases, it's super confusing. We don't really need, honestly, you don't even really need to understand it. You just need to know that energy projects can't increase the sound level by a certain amount, right? You don't need to be a soundologist to understand sort of that basic concept. And so we're sort of looking at that concept as part of this rulemaking. Does that make sense?
Well, sort of. So if
it doesn't, yeah, no. Yeah.
So just so I kind of get my head wrapped around it, and
Sure.
we won't belabor it, but
I belabored it for months, so go for it.
One person is singing and they're singing at 1 dBA, and you add another person singing and they're now you're getting 2 dBA. What you're saying is that the new rules for solar facilities could not exceed that additional an additional 10 dBA.
No. So what it is it's let's just use a better example. You measure the sound at the project, and what you measure is 30 dBA. You just have a microphone out there wherever it is. It's 30 dBA. Then you model how loud it's going to be once you build your project there. It can't be more than 40.
Okay, yeah, that's what I asked. So we're good.
Yeah. So yeah, it's just real simple. How you calculate that? It's not like it's actually pretty complicated. It's not just A plus B equals C or whatever. But needless to say, there's people who know how to do it, and the end result is that your project cannot increase the sound level by more than 10 dBA at the area that you're building the project.
Yeah, thanks. That answered my question.
Okay. All right, let's go to the next slide here. So let's look at the first sort of impact on the rules here. The first major change we're making is we're adding a sentence here that basically says, or it already says it for wind, it's now going to say or solar. And it would allow developers to continue to measure the actual noise level, which, you can go out there and put a microphone out there, or you can save yourself some time and money, and you can just assume that it's going to be 26 dBA. So unless there's already existing data that shows that the value is higher. So this is just a simple efficiency measure. Rather than forcing developers to go out and spend the money and the time to get this data, we just say, hey, let's just assume it's 26 dBA. And you might think, well, what if it's quieter than that? Let's go to the next slide. So 26 dBA is very quiet. It depending on where you look, 25 dBA is essentially a whisper. 30 dBA is the inside of a library, assuming there aren't a whole bunch of children in there. It's pretty quiet. So we're saying you can assume 26 dBA, but that's a very conservative value. But not having to go out and measure a value, it may be 28, it may be 29, it may be 24. Although, based on my research, this is a very conservative value. But the other thing to realize is that the modeled sound, this is the part that was really confusing to me, is that it's additive. So if it's noisy where you're at, your model is still going to show, I don't want to totally confuse you all, but it sort of doesn't matter what the assumed value. This is one of the reasons why we're doing this. It doesn't really matter what the value is. If your project is noisy, it's going to increase the value by more than 10 dBA, right? So if it's really quiet and your project is noisy, it could increase it by more than 10 dBA. If it's noisy and your project is noisy, it could still increase it by more than 10 dBA. So the project still can't exceed certain sort of operational parameters. This is just a kind of a recognition that it doesn't really make sense to make people go out and measure a base value unless they want to, and they certainly still can. This is just an option for developers to sort of save themselves some trouble. If they want to, they can use 26 dBA, or they can go measure it themselves. Anybody have any questions about this one? Go ahead, Brandon.
I just want to double check that this 26 threshold or cutoff limit or however you want to phrase it is the current number for wind. All
Yes.
we're doing is adding solar. So we're not reinventing the wheel here. We're using
That's right.
everything that's currently there and we're just adding solar to it.
That's correct.
Okay.
So you got to wonder why they didn't just do or solar to begin with 20 years ago. But 20 years ago, solar didn't really make a lot of economic sense. It was really expensive, and wind didn't make economic sense. So maybe 20 years ago, it didn't even occur to people that we would be building solar projects, especially in the state of Oregon. So they probably just didn't think that they needed to. But here we are 20 years later, and the technology has dramatically changed. Yvonne, do you have a question?
Yeah, so my question is, I know you were saying that for the actual project itself, that they could go by that baseline or measure the baseline themselves. Can the property owners get some type of equipment to make sure that they measure that baseline and it stays at that? And then if it increases, they can speak to someone?
So the way the rule is written now, it says unless I have the actual data, I have to look at the exact language, but it doesn't mention anything about property owners measuring it. But let me just look at this real quick. So it currently says the increase in ambient statistical noise levels is based on an assumed background ambient noise level of 26 dBA or the actual ambient background level. So I suppose, if the background value level is known, then it wouldn't matter how it was known. So I guess a landowner could do it. But of course, there's always issues of like, did you measure it? Did you have the sensitive equipment? Like, did you do it correctly? So I'm not. This actually is not really my area of expertise. I have to look into that for you to give you kind of a long answer. But the way the rule is currently written right now for wind, it's 26 dBA or the actual value.
Okay, I just thought maybe property owners would be very useful for them to know exactly what they would need to be able to see if it is affecting their property and their peace.
Yeah. This was the part that was really hard for me to understand. Is that this sort of the baseline value? It doesn't really matter if you live next to a bubbling creek and there's a lot of birds and stuff and it's really loud. A solar installation could still increase the volume by 10 dBA and that would be a problem. So whether your property happens to be super quiet or not, adding a bunch of noise is still adding a bunch of noise, right? So that's why the baseline value doesn't really matter. It does and it sort of doesn't. You need to know it to do the calculation, but it's not. I don't think it's very significant from even from your thinking about it solely from your perspective. You kind of care how loud the project is, not how loud your property is.
Thank you. I think that answers it.
Okay. Next slide. All right. So allowing a 26 dBA was the first thing that the wind rules did in 2004 that we want to copy. The second thing is more significant, and this is allowing a waiver. So currently, if it's 11 dBA, you can't build it. Full stop. And sound is an issue at the source, right? So the old tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it. Does it make a sound? It does not make a sound. I mean, from the perspective of the waiver, right? So you do a noise sensitive receptor and you would say, where is it exceeded by 10 dBA? And let's say it's 3 homeowners in the area, 3 landowners. You would need a waiver from each of those landowners. And currently you can't get a waiver. Even if landowners like, oh, I'd love to give you guys a waiver, and get that built. They don't have the authority. DEQ doesn't have the authority, and ODO doesn't have the authority. So this rule change would give the authority to issue a waiver to a homeowner. They don't have to. They could say no. I don't want to issue a waiver. You have to be quieter than 10 dBA or don't build it. So this gets all the power into the hands of the homeowner. So how would that work? Let's go to the next slide here. So the way that would work is because think about it from a developer perspective, you would not want to have to deal with constantly getting waivers. A waiver would have to be recorded with the county and it would accompany the legal titles of the property. So if you then sold to a future buyer, you would need to tell them there is a lien, essentially a noise lien on the property that we have waived the sound degradation standard for the developer. So whoever purchased that property would be subject to that waiver as well. And so it would exist in perpetuity along with the title to the property. Which sort of, okay, Brandon, you have a question?
Yeah, sorry. So would the waivers be coming from you all at the state, or would the counties have the waiver to provide to a property owner if they wanted to sign?
Oh, the actual form?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. I mean, the waivers are coming from the people. I don't necessarily know that you would even need a form. You would have to, I mean, if I'm the developer, in order to get this built, I have to meet the sound rules. If it exceeds that, I then have to show that I've obtained a waiver. So you would negotiate with the landowner of what that would look like, assuming they were willing to give you the waiver. You would record it with the county, and then you would show to ODO, to the siting team, here's the duly recorded waiver that I obtained with the county. So I don't necessarily know that there would need to be a form.
Well, just as the, I guess, representative of the counties, right? I would
Sure.
want to make sure that if we are responsible for making sure that these waivers are connected to the properties, that the waiver checks all the boxes that it needs to. It has all the information that it needs to have on it. So just wanted to find out whether the waiver document was being put together by you all, or not, you know, DEQ, Odo, FSEC, whoever, or if it's something that the counties would be responsible for putting together, since we have the authority to cite solar projects as well.
Sure, that's a great question. I don't have your answer, but I do know that we've been doing it for wind for the last 20 years. So whatever they've been doing, this is what we're going to keep doing. But I can figure out what we've been doing for wind, and I can let you know what that would look like.
Yeah, no, that would be great. You know, there are some counties obviously that have experience citing wind, but some that don't, and they might be interested in citing solar instead, because it's, you know, the sun shines more than the wind
Yeah,
blows,
so
right, as
these
an example.
rules,
So
yeah, these are broader than just, so we care about them from Odo's perspective because we deal with citing these large energy projects. These rules apply to any solar project that would require approval from the county. So they would apply to locally cited projects as well, not just projects that are dealt with by Odo. So that's a great point. But I'm curious to see if there was a kind of a standard form that was used for the wind projects. There's got to be, but I haven't looked into that. That's a great question.
Looks like we
So
have
obviously,
David. David has a question.
Yeah, David, go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's the developer that gets the form together, the same as a lease or anything, and then it's recorded at the county as a recorded easement. And that, yeah, but I just am saying I have utilized this for wind projects in the past.
Great, thank you, David. Yeah, there you go. So you may be wondering, or maybe you're not, but in case you are, why would somebody issue a waiver? It all comes down to money. So this is just like any other case where you would have sort of a lien on the property, and the developer either can, you know, make an offer that the landowner can't refuse, or they can't. You know, and that's just sort of between the developer and the landowner, whether or not they can come to a sort of agreement about what it's worth to both parties to move forward. But that's just sort of, this rule change isn't forcing anything forward. Landowners would still have the ability to say, no, you know, you could offer me $1 trillion and I still don't want you, I'm not going to give you a waiver. And because it exceeds 10 dBA, that's it. Project can't go forward unless the developer can figure out how to mitigate in a way that would meet that standard. You know, there are things you can do to mitigate sound. They cost money, and that may be cheaper than getting a waiver. But this sort of lets the market find the best solution. Maybe for where you want to site the project, it would be really expensive to mitigate, and it would just be cheaper to just pay a landowner, you know, X dollars a year or whatever, just sort of to get that waiver on their property. Does anybody have any other questions about this aspect of the rule change? Okay, go ahead. Next slide, Rachel. One important thing to note, and this was true for the wind rules, and is going to continue to be true for the solar version, which again is just, we're literally just adding the words "or solar" to the existing rules where it currently just says wind. But you cannot waive sound degradation that exceeds sort of, we call it the table 8 limits. So in the rules, there's a table. This is a screenshot of it essentially, called table 8, which has an allowable statistical noise level in any given hour. And there are sort of 2 time ranges, basically during the day and during the night. So you have to be even quieter at night than you are during the day. If your project models to exceed these levels, then it doesn't matter if the landowner is willing to sign a waiver and you're willing to, you know, pay the money that it would take to get such waiver. Your project cannot exceed these levels. And this is the only time, honestly, where the baseline noise level would really matter, because the modeled number is impacted by the baseline. So if you're going to build a noisy project in a noisy area, the likelihood you're going to exceed these values is higher than if you're going to build a noisy project in a quiet area. Yeah, that's sort of beside the point. But needless to say, you can't waive these table 8 limits. So if you exceed them, project can't go forward. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, go ahead, next slide. Okay, so we are adding one little bit of language to the existing rules where it's more than just saying or solar. And this is really just about clarifying the calculation. And I'm going to try not to confuse you any more than I perhaps already have. But we're adding 2 sort of sentences to the rules. And that's represented on the next 2 slides. So we are making it clear, in case it wasn't before, that the calculation of the generated noise includes surrounding energy facility noise. So basically, you know, what was the example before about building an energy project? If you're building it in a really noisy area, your model sort of already has to account for that. But let's say you're building in an area where there's like 6 projects that are proposed. It's not noisy yet, but you can't ignore the reality that those other projects are going to get built when doing your noise calculations. So this is just a recognition that, like, you know, if we were to build a power line somewhere and it suddenly becomes really attractive to build solar in a certain area because it's adjacent to that just power distribution, great. You know, let's build 6 projects right there. But you can't build yours and ignore the reality that other things are potentially going to be built there as well. So if there are 3 approved projects, the fourth project has to model the sound based on the other projects being built. And so this is sort of to prevent unintended noise creep. Max, you had a question. I figured you would.
Yeah, I have a couple questions on this and probably some comments later.
Yeah.
The first question is it actually even possible? And if so, how would one go about backing out other energy facilities in order to determine a baseline?
That's a good question. And the only calculations you have to do are based on approved projects. And approved projects are approved to build in certain areas. So you would essentially have the data, and in order to get the approval, they would have to show the model generated noise. So you basically have the data. Let's say 3 projects get approved but are not yet built, and you're the 4th project. You want to build in the area, sort of in the region. We debated about putting this language in here, and it was just sort of like, honestly, we're not like, and maybe this is where the RAC could sort of help us out a little bit here, but I don't actually think this is going to be a major issue of concern because of sound attenuation. So if you have essentially a project, and then you have another project next to that, and then you have another project next to that, and they're relatively big projects, the cumulative effect of that may not actually be as significant because if just everything's really spread out, right? So like if you have sort of electrical equipment here, and then 2 miles away you have electrical equipment here, and 2 miles away you have electrical equipment here, like the sound falls off for each project. As the distance increases, the perceived sound level drops with it. So is a whole bunch of projects kind of being built in the same area even going to be an issue? I don't necessarily know that it is, but we just put this in here just in case. So it's a sort of a thing where it's probably not a problem, but we want these rules in here so so we're not finding ourselves 2 years from now thinking that we should have put these rules in here because it ended up being a bigger problem than it was. So I don't know if that made sense to you, Max, but we're sort of not worried about it based on how sound physically works in the world. But we didn't want to create a situation where we regretted not making this little tweak here while we have the chance, because the rulemaking isn't exactly super easy or cheap for that matter. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I hear you on that. And just to preview commentary later, we had a conversation, Emily and I, earlier this week with an acoustical engineer who is concerned about this. So, we can get there down the road.
Honestly, if you've talked to an acoustical engineer and you have some thoughts, I'd love to hear them. So definitely submit some comments.
Yeah, happy to do that. The other question is, was it a policy choice on the part of the agencies to extend this sort of cumulative impact standard only to wind and solar? Because the way the rules are currently written, it would apply only to the types of projects that currently Oregon energy policy is designed to support, and it would not actually apply to any other energy facilities.
It's sort of a function of the fact that we are only looking at the DEQ noise rules that apply to wind and solar. So it's not that they're being targeted. It's just that it's like we're making this little tweak to the solar noise rules, or to the noise rules to also apply to solar. So I guess, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, it's sort of a reality that all the projects being proposed right now in the state of Oregon are essentially solar. So I guess we're targeting it, but it's just sort of the reality of the fact that that's everything that's being proposed.
Yeah, I guess, well, I'm not sure what the current status is. I know there were a series of 24.9 megawatt gas generators proposed roughly a year ago that would be county jurisdictional in order to avoid FSEC jurisdiction. These rules apply to other facilities. So it does seem a little jarring to have a higher standard now, again, for these types of resources that the state is trying to make permitting more efficient for, when that same cumulative standard wouldn't apply to other energy facilities.
Sure, although I don't know how many of those are all being proposed to be built in the same place, in the same, such that they would then generate noise that would be then calculated when calculating the noise generated by adjacent facilities. So I don't know, it sort of seems like sort of an edge case. But I hear you. This would ultimately potentially be a restriction, but it would only be a restriction if the whole bunch of projects were going to make a whole bunch of noise. So if that's not the case, then this isn't an issue. This is only an issue if it is an issue, in which case we probably do care. So, but should it also apply to fossil fuel? For county, for like smaller projects, I don't know. I'd have to talk to Todd about this, but that's certainly a good question to raise.
It looks like we have a question in the chat from Brandon. Brandon, did you want to come up and mute and make sure you ask your question?
Oh, sure. I feel like I've spoken a lot, so I figured I would just ask it there. But
Oh, no, you're fine.
the question that I had were, if these noise requirements, the documentation around the noise requirements would be required to be met before a county planning department issues the permit. I would assume the answer is yes, but since it's a new component, I would want to make sure that my planning department folks know that they potentially would need to wait for the sound data or necessary documentation be filed before they start issuing these permits. So that was my question: is when exactly is some of this information needing to be required and filed?
Yeah, so the way the rule is currently being proposed is this sentence here: the increase in ambient statistical noise generated by the wind or solar energy facility shall be calculated to account for any energy facilities approved by FSEC or a local government. So it would only apply to projects that have already been approved but not yet been built, or that have been built. But it just, yeah. So built or unbuilt but approved. Okay, I mean, it's, go ahead and go to the next slide here, and you'll see this is sort of the corollary to the one we just did. So then this is just making it clear. There's I'll just read the sentence here. Actual ambient background level does not include noise generated or caused by the wind energy facility is the current sentence. So we're proposing to change it to actual ambient background level does not include noise generated or caused by energy facilities approved by the Energy Facility Siting Council or a local government. So we're just tweaking this to make it clear that the ambient background level does not include projects that are either existing, which is the way it's written now, or approved. So you can't basically get sound credit for things that are being built. But this only applies to energy facilities. So if obviously if it's really noisy there, then it's really noisy there, and that would affect the base level. We're just making it clear that the calculation for the base level doesn't include energy projects. So these two changes together are just being done. Honestly, the ultimate result is that it just increases the likelihood that you would need to get a waiver. That's all. Because either if your thing is below the table 8 limit or above the table 8 limit, then these calculations don't really matter. And if it's below the table 8 limit, but it exceeds 10 dBA, then you would need to get a waiver. If you didn't add this language, there are sort of edge cases where you wouldn't need to get a waiver. That's the ultimate result of these two slides. Is potentially, maybe never, but potentially there could be a situation where, because we've made it clear that this is how the sound is calculated, now the sound exceeds 10 dBA and you would need to get a waiver. Maybe never, but that's the result. Okay. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So that's it. It's sort of really confusing, but we're also not doing a whole lot. So just to recap, we're saying you don't have to do any calculations. You can assume the 26 dBA. Make the project just a little bit quicker, a little bit more efficient. It's a conservative number, but there's no reason to do a calculation when we can, if you choose to use the 26 dBA and save yourself some time and money. The second change is, if your project exceeds 10 dBA but is less than the table 8 limits, then we are now allowing you, just like we've done for the last 20 years with wind projects, to seek waivers from the affected landowners. Just like with the wind projects, they don't have to give you those waivers. But if they do, it's attached to the property. And when you sell your land, the next buyer is also sort of, they get the benefit too. I mean, it's attached to the property. So, and then making it clear, just to prevent sort of edge cases of sort of noise degradation, that when we do these calculations, they have to take into account other projects that have been approved, even if they haven't been built yet, so that we don't end up with a situation where suddenly, we approve 8 things, but none of them get built. And so it's still really quiet. And then you're the 9th one. And then all of a sudden they all get built and now it's really super loud. But it's like, if we'd have known that these were going to get, this is just to deal with that situation. Okay. Any questions now that I've sort of recapped? It's okay. We had a lot of questions going through it, so we don't need to have any more if people feel like they understand it. Why don't you go ahead and go to the next slide, Rachel?
We actually had a 15-minute break slotted, but I think if we're good to just skip past that, I think the next would be a public comment period. Oh, actually, I apologize. No. Oh, it looks like Max, you have a question.
Go for it, Max.
I don't have questions. I do have further comments on the baseline piece.
It doesn't have to be a question. You're here to provide your thoughts.
Fair enough. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to go through our basic thinking on that piece, which is, if I have it correctly, and this wasn't covered in the intro material, but the first time I heard about this rulemaking being a possibility was in the Department of Energy's report on implementation of Governor Brown's Executive Order 2004 on climate, identifying this proposed rule change as sort of low-hanging fruit for trying to make it more efficient to site and permit solar projects in the state. I think against that backdrop, is finding this sort of cumulative impacts issue in the change to the baseline, not only for solar, but also for wind facilities, as I mentioned before, was kind of jarring and surprising. And in fact, we only really realized it earlier this week when we were walking through the proposed rules with an acoustical engineer in our membership. And so we haven't had the chance even to let our wind developer members know that there's a potential proposed change to how they would have to apply the noise standard to their facilities, let alone the solar piece. Do have concerns that this proposed language would apply only to wind and solar facilities and not other issues, not only in terms of citing new wind and solar facilities, but also in terms of which, the noise from what other facilities is excluded from the baseline. It seems odd, again, to take a sort of resource that is nominally preferred under Oregon policy and only identify that as for like harsher treatment than you would a highway or other noise generating uses of land that could, depending on policy choices by the agencies, be included or excluded in a baseline. We feel like the issue of cumulative noise impacts is already adequately addressed by those Table 8 limits that you talked about. That seems like, in my view, what the Table 8 limits are designed to get at. And then we do have some concerns about how this would actually work in practice, as I I appreciated your answer on that, Tom, and I can see where that's coming from. But like the example that the engineer we talked to gave us was kind of imagine a property with one facility located directly to its west and another facility located directly to its east. When the engineer is doing sound impact studies related to each facility, that includes issues like the direction of the wind affecting the level of the noise. And so if you're assessing the potential noise impacts, you could be looking at sort of a physically impossible situation where you pass the threshold only if the wind is coming from both the east and the west and carrying that noise at the same time. So he said, from my perspective, it just doesn't make sense. And I think that's worth thinking about as you decide whether to try to carry this language through to the final proposed rules that you take to the director. So that's kind of the series of concerns that this language raised for us in a nutshell. And if it would be helpful, we're happy to submit written comments down the road going into things in more detail. But again, just overall a little surprised by this, especially given the way this rulemaking was messaged and like the summary of the proposed rules, which didn't go into this at all. We kind of had to go digging to find it, which was disappointing.
Yeah, no, I hear you, Max. I guess it's sort of this sort of came about as the result of the projects being built on top of one another. So for let's say you already have a wind project and you want to add solar panels to it. How do you do that calculation? Do you use the ambient level that existed before the wind did? Let's say they use the 26 assumed dBA. Or now that you're adding solar, do you have to account for the fact that now you're sticking the solar project on to an existing wind site that is producing sound? So that's the reason why we literally had this situation come up a couple of weeks ago with an energy project that's currently being proposed. So when you looked at the rules, we're like, it's not clear what we do in that situation. So we sort of wanted to make it clear how you calculate the sound when you're dealing with multiple projects that are being sort of built on top of the other. And we sort of have to make a decision as policymakers, what do we want to err on the side of? Is it making it as easy as possible to site these projects? Or do we want to make sure that we protect, these sort of resources, in this case, sound degradation? And we sort of came out where we did because ultimately, you can't exceed the table eight limit either way. This is just sort of like an edge case that will only be relevant, in very few cases. And if it is, the remedy is just to seek a waiver it's like the edge cases of the edge cases. So our best guess is this will never come in. This will potentially never be an issue. And if it is, the remedy is not that difficult. So but that being said, we would love to hear if you've spoken to an audio expert and you have sort of some analysis that they've done that would sort of maybe sway us in a different direction. Please, it is worth your time to submit that. We will look at it. We will think about it. So we're not just here to rubber stamp anything. And if RAC members, go out and do their own research, I mean, that's like catnip for me. So, I'd love, we want to make the best decisions that we can. And the way you do that is with the best information. So if you have additional information that would be helpful, I would definitely urge you to submit that.
Next time we will try to pull something together for you.
Okay, great. So on that, let's go to the next slide. And if you guys are okay, I would say let's just zoom to the end here, because basically it's just Q&A if there is any. Oh, this is also an important slide here. We did submit a draft sort of fiscal and racial equity impact. We have to do this for every rulemaking. This is one of those things, if you don't do it right, your rulemaking could be completely invalidated, regardless of the sort of goodness or badness of the rules. This is a thing that we need to do, and we need to do a good job of it. So we've sort of taken a stab at assessing these impacts. And as you can see here on the slide, we don't really think this is going to change much. This will reduce potentially a little bit of the data that needs to be studied by staff, so that will make it easier to process applications. It will reduce costs for developers who won't have to potentially go out and do all that research. They can just use the assumed value. And potentially projects will go forward that weren't able to go forward before, because developers can now seek waivers, whereas before they couldn't. So that's sort of the impact these rules would apply to everybody. Sort of there aren't really any sort of focused impacts. These programs are I guess largely would impact areas where you would have solar. So there is sort of that focused impact, but it's not as direct as some rulemakings can potentially be. But anyways, you could hopefully had a chance to review the draft impact statement that we submitted. And I guess here's where I would open it up to the group. Does anybody disagree with our findings or thoughts about the impact that these rules will have? And if so, please let me know. Please speak up. We're also going to have, just as a reminder, we'll go over this in a second, but sort of a week here for the RAC to comment before we move forward. We're going to take sort of pause. We're not going to just zoom to the next step. That would be a great time for you, Max, to submit some comments. But if you had anything related to the fiscal racial equity impact analysis, that would also be a great time to submit that as well. And if you miss it, then you could just submit it as part of the public comment period. But if you want it to be sort of part of the package that we pitch to the public, then it needs to be submitted in the next week. And Rachel just linked it again. I did attach it to the email I sent to the RAC members, but there it is again. If you want, you can just click it and download it. All right. If nobody has any thoughts or questions about that, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Yeah.
So we had another little section here, but I think we're good. So let's just move on to the public comment.
Yvonne, go ahead.
Okay,
Go
I
ahead.
do have a question. So that
Sure.
does that also include the construction time, like the pile drivers and the things that they have to, the cement, 20 feet deep and all that's on the project order? Does that include that in the noise?
That's a great question that I don't know the answer to off the top of my head. But my understanding of the the DEQ rules is that applies to the project as built. So, which is to say, not including the sound of pile drivers and all that stuff. I do think there are FSEC sort of ODO rules that apply to how a project is built and the impacts of the actual project construction. But that's not these particular rules that we're looking at today. These rules only apply to the projects once they're done, so that they're ongoing effects.
Will there be new rules, especially since they're looking at areas that are very rural, very quiet, and residential rural?
So so we have all these standards that projects have to comply with, and certainly if an area is let's old growth forest or something like that. I mean, haven't helped anybody who wants to build a project on something like that. But we do take into account the existing sort of state of the land when analyzing the impacts that building it and having it exist in perpetuity would have. But again, that's sort of fluff at this point, because this particular rulemaking is just this sort of one specific thing. But to answer your question, we are actually taking a look at all of those rules. Probably aren't going to get to them until next year, but we are actually going to go through all of the siting standards that projects have to meet to be built, at least approved at the ODO level. These wouldn't necessarily apply to the county level, but for larger projects, we are re-examining all of those rules, because a lot of those standards were written for fossil fuel production. So we're just sort of going to take a second look at them and think, do these rules make sense in a world where at least all the stuff that these rules would apply to, the larger projects, is pretty much all wind and solar. So we are going to be looking at those rules going forward. T. Cornett. This is my boss, by the way, everybody. Todd, why don't you?
Just for the records, it's being recorded. Todd Cornett, Assistant Director for Siting at the Oregon Department of Energy. Just to respond a little bit to Yvonne's comment. So yeah, the noise rules don't apply to construction. They're just operation. But we would typically, and we have typically within a review of a project, would put time limits on construction because in an area, a residential or other types of uses, that would then limit, sort of before a certain hour and after a certain hour. So these rules wouldn't do that, but just our own process, we would take that into consideration, but it wouldn't preclude, noise levels during construction, generally just at certain times.
Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. Okay, well, this brings us to the public comment portion of today's RAC. So if there are any members of the public, Rachel, did you want to, can they raise their hands now?
Yeah, I put
They
something
have
in the
ability?
chat. Yep, I put
Oh.
something in the chat for people to raise their hand, or if you're on the phone today, press *9, and we will call on you in the order your hand is raised. If you would like to give comment today here in this meeting.
Let's give it 30 seconds or so.
Okay. And I would say, I think, this could include the RAC members as well.
Oh yeah,
It's
if you
not
have like us, absolutely.
yeah. But again, just for everyone, as a reminder, we will have a week-long comment period. So we'll be accepting written comments, and I'll drop the rulemaking inbox in the chat here. But yeah, next Friday would be the deadline to get those into us. We'll give it a few more seconds, but I don't know that we'll have any public comment today. But just for the record, here is the rulemaking inbox.
Yeah, that's noise.2024@deq.oregon.gov. In case you can't read the chat. And Rachel will forward anything you send to me, so I'll be able to take a look at it. And then again, if you just had any questions about rulemaking in general, maybe you want to get more involved in future rulemakings that are a little bit more, I would say, involved than this one likely will be, where there's sort of more questions up in the air and where there's more brainstorming going on. Certainly, nothing is in stone here with respect to this one here. We're going to take any comments submitted very seriously, and before we submit the draft as part of the notice of proposed rulemaking. But there are, just as as many of you know, there are other rulemakings that are potentially a lot more involved, and they certainly are on the pipeline for ODO. We have a lot of sort of energy siting related rulemakings that are going to be really important and significant in terms of how they impact how projects are sited in the state of Oregon. There's a lot going on, so there's a lot of eyes on how this process works, and a lot of opinions on all sides in terms of how it should work. So yeah, I just sort of throwing that out there as a pitch. I'm going to be submitting a schedule with a lot of future rulemakings on it, and if you're interested in any of those, do please make note of it.
Great. Oh, yeah, David?
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure we were had enough time for the public to make a comment. I just wanted to say thank you for this. I think it is reasonably well thought out. To Max's comment, it's probably a little bit easier when it's the same developer or same entity that is developing, a couple projects, or it's phased, right? Because often you get projects that get phased over time, phased in over time, than it is when it's a different developer, and what you would have to include, what the sort of modeling you would have to include from the sound emissions from the other project. So I'm working through that, thinking through that, and we'll see if I can provide any comments, or working with also others on the phone and on the RAC that of how that might work, or how we could change it so that the principle is fine. It's just making sure that we don't get into the really bizarre situation where, as you said, wind going in the same direction, pointing towards a single receptor at the same time, with everything built. These things don't actually happen in reality, and so we got to make sure that we're at least reasonable in how we do it. That's all.
I totally agree. And honestly, one of my biggest concerns, in addition to just doing my job poorly, generally, is I have nightmares about, unintended consequences. As whenever you create new rules, there's always an opportunity to sort of like, oh, we should have thought of that, or we didn't think of that. That's the whole point of the RAC, is to help me sleep better at night. And that's this whole point of having this as a sounding board and saying, here's what we've been thinking. Here's what, we did put a lot of thought into this, but like, there's always a chance that there's things we didn't think about, and there's consequences, whether it's, sort of the rules are really plain forward and simple as they're drafted, but you might end up in this weird situation where something that wasn't intended is how the rules are read. So yeah, I really appreciate your comments, David, and also Max, on that front. So we'll definitely be looking at that issue and putting some more thought into it to make sure that we're comfortable with that language. All right, I think that's good. Adequate time for the public comment. I don't think we're going to see anybody on that front.
Yeah.
So why don't you go ahead and take it over, Rachel?
Okay. So rulemaking next steps. We do have this presentation on the rulemaking website, as well as the draft rules that reflect what we've presented here today, the proposed rules. as well as the fiscal and racial equity impact statement that we also alluded to earlier. Just wanted to say special thanks to our rulemaking advisory committee for joining us today and for being so flexible as we work through some of the obstacles that we had to deal with in the past. So thank you for sticking with us. Thank you for being here. And thank you for your thoughtful comments today. Again, we're accepting written comment until next Friday at noise.2024@deq.oregon.gov. Again, we're preparing to finalize the notice of proposed rulemaking and file that with the Secretary of State at the end of this month. And that will kick off a 21-day comment period. So that's 3 weeks, calendar days, in which anyone will be able to submit comment, and that will be incorporated in the next steps to go back to the rules and fine tune as needed. So that's all I have. Here are the rulemaking resources as well, the webpage. And then, subscribe to DEQ notifications in order to get updates on this rulemaking. And that's all we have. Just want to say thank you.
Special thanks to Yvonne and Troy for this is their first RAC they've ever been on. So
Yes.
Really appreciate you guys stepping up and being willing to participate. It's really important for us that we have members of the public who have legitimate questions, concerns about what this means for them, and you do kind of represent so many people who would potentially be interested in this, but they have busy lives and they just maybe most people don't even understand that this is happening. So for you to participate and sort of be paying attention, it means a lot.
Definitely. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll go ahead and stop the recording now.